was an international conference in Sun City, in South Africa, an international conference with anthropologists, paleontologists, and other researchers. And their conclusions at the end of that conference was that there's no doubt that humanity began in Africa, and it appears as though the focus, the central point for the development of human beings was in South Africa, as opposed to Tanzania or Kenya as was previously thought. I had an opportunity to visit an area right outside of Johannesburg called Sterkfontein Caves. And it was in this cave where they found the skeleton of a female, which they originally thought was approximately 250,000 years old. This is Homo sapiens sapien, a human being. And they've just recently reanalyzed this skull and said that this African female was at least 300,000 years old. So what is becoming more clear as they do the research, that we have been on this planet much longer than they have ever imagined. We have been on this planet. And thus they also know that they are recent arrivals into the family of humanity. They understand that. They've also done, okay, yeah, sharpen it up. They've also done research, genetic research. In 1998 was when news of this research, this image will be a little bit better. News of this research was first made public in 1988 when geneticists studied the placentas of a number of women, all so-called races, all so-called nationalities. They studied the placentas in order to examine the mitochondrial DNA, which is that part of the cell structure which is passed on to a child from their mother. And they concluded that every person on earth has one common denominator. That is, every living human being on earth, or every human being who has ever lived, has possessed within their genetic structure the mitochondrial DNA, which links them to a group of women who are still living today in Africa. Again, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that we were the very first human beings on earth. Now, of course, you know, in recent years, they've developed a similar genetic test in order to determine the paternal DNA genes that have been passed on through one's bloodline. And they applied this test to the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Hemings. All right? And were able to substantiate beyond a reasonable doubt that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least one child by his enslaved mistress, Sally Hemings. All right? Well, she was a child. You can call her rape. That's what it was. But it's interesting to understand their psychosis and not to allow us to internalize their psychosis. The descendants of Thomas Jefferson said that it was impossible for this man to have sex with a slave. It was impossible. He was a moral man and he couldn't engage in an action which would contradict his brilliance. Well, it just goes to show, one, he was a man, and two, he was a white man. So let us not get caught up in their confusion, and let us not engage in a debate in an issue which does not need to be discussed. All right? If we are clear about the issues that we've been confronted with over the years. And with regards to the development of civilization in Africa, if it is true that humanity began in Africa, then we have to acknowledge the fact that the first civilization also began in Africa. The first system of writing, the first system of government, the first system of language and laws, science, mathematics, and medicine also had their origins in Africa, and their origins in a civilization which reached its height in the nation that was called Kemet, now referred to today as Egypt. And Europeans had a need, had a desire to recreate as best they could the symbolic and architectural legacy of ancient Egypt. They had a desire because for hundreds of years they mistakenly believed that the Egyptians were white because they had been miseducated too. And so if you understand the true origins of ancient Kemet, understand its African origins, and with that understanding, you can then move throughout the world and then claim those symbols that are part of your ancestors that have been appropriated by Europeans in order to try to make themselves something that they never were. And so in Washington, D.C., some 13 years ago, I designed a tour, an African-centered tour of Washington, D.C., which analyzed the architecture of that city and interpreted the symbolism related to that architecture in order to establish a fact, a historical fact, that the designers of Washington, D.C. attempted to recreate architecturally and symbolically the spiritual essence of ancient Kemet in order to infuse this newly formed nation with a force which would allow them to become the most powerful ruling body on earth. They have become that. They have become that. But what they also have done is to remove from our memory any knowledge of our links to the symbols that they appropriated from our ancestors. And so it was about 2 years ago when the brothers and sisters here at UAM came to Washington, D.C. for one of my African-centered tours, and I've just had a conversation prior to coming up here, and it appears as though they're going to make arrangements for another tour, African-centered tour of Washington, tentatively on April the 11th. And since you all have taken your last tour, I've added some other components, which essentially puts the nail in the coffin and proves beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly what the Europeans were doing. So when you come to Washington and you see that symbol, the symbol which symbolizes the most powerful nation on earth is a symbol which represents the resurrection of an African God. We cannot forget that. We cannot afford to disassociate ourselves from the historical significance of that symbol. It represents an African God who was born on December the 25th, at least 6,000 years before their God, Jesus. It represents an African God who was murdered, and after death, his spirit came and impregnated his wife, who was a virgin. And then this virgin woman gave birth to their son, who was born on the same day as his father, December the 25th. And this son was charged with the responsibility of restoring his father's kingdom on earth. Heru. This is what this symbol represents. And we should not allow anyone to misrepresent this symbol. It's also identified as a phallic symbol. This symbol, the meaning of this symbol it has multiple interpretations. And we have to be able to know which interpretation to apply at which particular time. And so this symbol did at one time represent the missing portion of a sar that his wife Aset did not find, his phallus, which was supposedly cut from his body and thrown into the Nile River and eaten by a catfish. But this symbol is a phallic symbol. A phallic symbol, a 555-foot high penis of an African that stands in the center of Washington, D.C. And if you understand that aspect of its history, maybe you can begin to understand why Bill Clinton can't keep his pants zipped up. See, the stuff works both ways. It works both ways. We also need to understand and be very clear of the mission of George Washington and the so-called founding fathers after they won their freedom from England and established this nation. We have to be very clear that the very first act that George Washington initiated was to pull together a team of men, a team of artists and researchers whose responsibility it was to design a symbol which was to represent the heart and soul of this newly developed nation. And so this team took 6 years to study, research, and design the symbol which became known as the Great Seal of the United States of America. So the artist in me asks you all to understand that when an artist is charged with something, a job of that importance, they don't take it lightly, because they know that their work is supposed to stand the test of time. And the men who were responsible for designing this symbol, the men who took 6 years to design the symbol, were very clear about what they were doing. So when you see these symbols, you have to understand that they represented George Washington and the so-called Founding Fathers' desire to recreate symbolically and spiritually the essence of ancient Kemet here in this country, the United States of America. Are there any pyramids in England, France, Germany, Russia, Nova Scotia, Scotland, Lithuania, Ireland? There were, at last count, 92 pyramids in Egypt, 15 pyramids in the Sudan, south of Egypt, a dozen pyramids in Ethiopia, south of the Sudan. The only place outside of the continent of Africa where you will find pyramids is right here in this hemisphere, in Mesoamerica, pyramids that were built by African people who navigated the Atlantic Ocean somewhere around 1000 BCE and brought with them knowledge of stone construction, concepts of God, calendar, astronomy, and mathematics, which they introduced to the indigenous people. So this symbol is a representation of the industrious nature of African people. So we have to be clear of what this symbol is and whose it is. Front of the Great Seal also speaks to this mission, this desire on the part of the so-called Founding Fathers to recreate symbolically the essence of ancient Kemet. So when you look at the front of the Great Seal, the so-called emblem of the United States of America, understand that symbol, but more importantly, understand the origins of that symbol. That symbol was copied from the national symbol of Kemet, which was a personification of Heru, the son of Asar and Aset. Heru, the son of God. I understand also the philosophical and spiritual differences between these two symbols. The symbol of ancient Kemet, the symbol of Heru, shows him looking to his right, which symbolizes the future, shows him holding in each of his talons a symbol called a shin, which represents infinity. And above the shin is a symbol called the ankh, which represents life. And so our ancestors were talking about this process of achieving infinite life.